Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back, way back, to a time when nobody brushed their teeth. Streets doubled as sewers, and public safety meant hoping your neighbor didn't stab you over bread. Welcome to medieval Europe, the cozy cradle of superstition, plagues, and, of course, serial killers who somehow managed to thrive centuries before fingerprints or common sense existed. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe pull that blanket a little tighter, because tonight we're sinking into the slow, grimy world of medieval murderers. The ones history politely pretended didn't exist. The ones who didn't wear crowns but still ruled through fear. Let's start with a man whose name sounds like a campfire story but whose crimes were as real as the mud under a peasant's boots. Gilles de Rais. The knight who lost his soul. Picture this. France. Mid-1400s. The 100 Years' War is dragging on like an endless group project nobody wants to finish. Somewhere among the knights, priests, and half-starved villagers is Gilles de Rais, a nobleman so rich he could have bought half of Brittany, and so mentally unwell he probably should have been chained to a monastery wall for everyone's safety. Now, Gilles wasn't always the monster he'd become. He started out as a national hero. He fought beside Joan of Arc, waved banners in glorious battles, and even got a few fancy titles out of it. He was called brave, devout, loyal. The medieval PR machine loved him, but like many noblemen, Gilles had one small problem. He had too much money and too little sanity. After the war, he retreated to his castle, surrounded himself with alchemists and occultists, and decided he could summon demons if he just sacrificed enough children. Of course he did. What followed is one of the darkest chapters in medieval history. For years, Gilles lured peasants' children to his estate under the promise of work or food. They never came back. He claimed he was performing spiritual experiments. The church called it what it was: mass murder wrapped in satanic theater. His trial in 1440 was basically a medieval horror show. Testimonies described rooms full of strange tools, blood-soaked floors, and rituals that sounded more like drunken fan fiction than religion. He confessed, cried a bit, and was hanged and burned for good measure. Medieval justice rarely believed in half measures, and that's Gilles de Rais. A man who went from holy warrior to serial killer, before the word serial killer even existed. Let's drift onward. Peter Stumpp. The werewolf of Bedburg next. Stumpp, Germany. 1589. Yes, technically post-medieval. But Europe was still medieval in spirit, plaguey, paranoid, and terrified of everything. Meet Peter Stumpp, a farmer who, according to his neighbors, could turn into a wolf and eat people, which sounds ridiculous until you realize he confessed under torture to killing and eating 13 people, including his own son. Peter claimed he had a magic belt given by the devil that turned him into a wolf whenever he wore it. Because, sure, that makes total sense. When authorities asked to see the belt, Peter said the devil took it back. How convenient now. Whether or not Peter actually believed this, the townsfolk absolutely did. They were thrilled to have a real, tangible monster to blame for all their missing goats and neighbors. So they gave him the full medieval send-off. Stretched on a wheel, torn apart with red-hot tongs, then burned, just to be sure. Sleepy moral of the story: Don't be weird in 16th century Germany. Someone will eventually decide you're a werewolf. Elizabeth Bathory. The blood countesser, yes, Elizabeth Bathory. The Hungarian noblewoman who allegedly bathed in the blood of virgins to stay young. Spoiler, she didn't. But she did torture and kill an alarming number of servants. So she's not exactly getting a sympathy card. Born in 1560, Elizabeth had all the ingredients for disaster: obscene wealth, too much free time, and a castle full of terrified peasants who couldn't say no. Over the years, she developed a taste for discipline, the kind that involved whips, needles, and ice baths. Rumors spread that she was drinking blood to keep her skin youthful, an early form of self-care that definitely didn't catch on. When local priests noticed the suspicious number of missing girls, the crown finally stepped in. Her trial was a political mess. Testimonies piled up, some exaggerated, others disturbingly consistent. The final count: over 600 victims, though that number's debated. The king, wisely unwilling to start a PR nightmare by executing a noblewoman, had her bricked inside her castle instead. She spent her last years walled up in a room, seeing no one, slowly fading from existence. It's poetic in a bleak, medieval sort of way. Let's float over to another royal disaster. The mysterious case of the Children's Crusade. Murderers somewhere around 1212. Tens of thousands of children set off from France and Germany on what was called the Children's Crusade, believing they could peacefully convert Muslims in the Holy Land. Spoiler, most didn't make it. Some starved, some were enslaved, and some, according to chroniclers, fell victim to opportunistic killers who followed their trail like wolves. One such man, Hugh the Iron, reportedly led a group of merchants who offered the children safe passage. Instead, he sold many into slavery. Others simply vanished. Though he wasn't a serial killer in the modern sense, his crimes carried the same cold pattern: vulnerable victims, deceit, and repetition. Eventually, justice caught up with him. He was hanged, his property seized, and his name forgotten by everyone except bored historians centuries later. And that's the thing about these medieval monsters. They weren't clever masterminds like modern TV villains. They were just broken people in a world that didn't have words for what they were. There was no psychology, no profile, no police database, just pitchforks, torches, and the occasional inquisitor with enthusiasm for fire. So, as you drift off tonight, maybe think about how far we've come, or haven't, because somewhere between the castles, the plagues, and the endless wars, humanity still found time for people like Gilles, Peter, and Elizabeth. Monsters born not out of myth, but out of boredom, greed, and the dark corners of the human mind so far. We've met knights turned killers, farmers turned werewolves, and nobles who treated human life like candle wax, cheap, disposable, and always running out. But the Middle Ages had a particular gift for producing people who seemed almost bored with evil, as if cruelty were a kind of hobby. Let's drift now to Italy. Warm sun, beautiful architecture, and the occasional homicidal nobleman who believed the rules didn't apply to him. Isolino da Romano, the tyrant who thought he was Destinizelli, was born around 1194 into one of those Italian families that produced more feuds than children. The Romanos were powerful, rich, and perpetually angry. Isolino grew up in that atmosphere: money, politics, and vendetta as family tradition. When most nobles were trying to carve out a little land for themselves, Ezzelino went further. He decided he'd simply take all of northern Italy. Why settle for a duchy when you could have an empire and a reputation for unrelenting cruelty? He joined forces with Emperor Frederick II because, of course, he did, and together they started tightening their grip on the region. Ezzelino became known for two things: efficient government and spectacular violence. His preferred method of civic improvement was mass imprisonment. Anyone who even looked vaguely rebellious ended up chained in his dungeons, where daylight was optional and food was a rumor. Chroniclers wrote about his castle of bones, a fortress filled with the remains of people who'd displeased him. He executed entire families because he didn't like their tone. When a town rebelled, he leveled it. He once captured 11,000 citizens and, rather than figure out what to do with them, had them all blinded, maimed, or executed, just to make his point clear. Ezzelino wasn't just cruel, he was methodical. He didn't rant or rave. He issued orders, ate dinner, and then had a few dozen people tortured before bed. To him, this was management. When he finally died in 1259, his enemies cut his body into pieces before burying it, an unsubtle medieval review of his leadership. Historians later struggled to decide whether he was insane or just very committed to his brand. Gilles, the hermit of the woods now. We wander north again, to France. The 1570s, the countryside around Dole was quiet, lonely, and occasionally missing a few children. Enter Gilles, a reclusive man who lived in the forest with his wife. You can imagine what that looked like too. Superstitious villagers, a bearded loner, living off berries, talking to trees, occasionally seen dragging something through the woods. Obviously a werewolf. After a series of grisly killings, the locals organized a massive hunt. Garnier was caught and confessed, under pressure, of course, to killing several children and eating parts of their bodies. He said the devil gave him an ointment that turned him into a wolf so he could feed his family. Medieval logic was flexible like that. He was executed by burning in 1573, the standard penalty for both witchcraft and making everyone deeply uncomfortable. The truth behind his confession: probably a mixture of starvation, isolation, and madness. But the villagers went home satisfied. Evil had been found and neatly disposed of in a bonfire. Let's float onward, into a slightly more civilized setting, if we can call royal courts civilized. Vlad Gapik, the prince who enjoyed sharp conversations, probably heard of him by another name, Vlad the Impaler, the Romanian prince who inspired Dracula. The funny part: the actual Dracula legend is the least disturbing thing about him. Vlad ruled Wallachia in the mid-1400s, and like many medieval rulers, he spent most of his time being invaded by his neighbors and betrayed by his own nobles. So he developed a creative leadership style, impaling anyone who annoyed him. When ambassadors refused to remove their hats in his presence, he nailed the hats to their heads. When Ottoman envoys invaded, he left forests of corpses lining the roads as a polite deterrent. Once, he reportedly invited 200 beggars to dinner, fed them generously, then locked the hall and set it on fire. His reasoning: he'd solved poverty. Vlad considered all this just good governance. In his mind, cruelty was efficiency, and in a twisted way, it worked. Crime dropped, taxes were paid on time, and his citizens lived in terrified obedience. After his death, local folklore painted him as a national hero, someone who fought corruption with extreme measures. It's a medieval paradox. You can be both monster and savior, depending on who's writing the chronicle. We'll take a slower breath here, because the next few figures weren't rulers or nobles, but commoners who slipped through the cracks of a chaotic world. People who could kill for years simply because no one thought to connect the dots. The Monk of Florence records from 14th Florence tell of a nameless monk expelled from his monastery after being caught indulging in forbidden acts, which, given the era, could mean anything from minor heresy to full-blown murder. After leaving, he lived on the outskirts of the city, offering blessings to travelers. Over time, people noticed that those travelers often didn't arrive where they were headed. When authorities eventually searched his hut, they found personal belongings, blood-stained robes, and bones buried nearby. The details are sparse. It's one of those medieval mysteries historians only have, but the whispers lingered for centuries. A monk turned killer, hiding behind the cloth. And isn't that perfectly medieval? A man devoted to God, undone by the same isolation that was supposed to save his soul. Moving shadows by now, we can see a pattern forming across the centuries. The medieval world, for all its faith and superstition, was a perfect hiding place for monsters. There were no newspapers, no central police, no way to share warnings beyond gossip and rumor. A killer could move from one village to another, change his name, join a monastery, or claim divine visions, and no one would question it. It wasn't just darkness that protected them. It was ignorance, and a strange, fatalistic belief that everything, good or evil, was simply God's will. That meant when a child vanished, people didn't immediately think predator, they thought devil. When someone was found dead, they blamed witches, curses, or bad omens. The idea that another human could repeatedly choose to kill just didn't fit into their worldview, so the monsters thrived quietly, half believed, half denied, until someone found a body. The candle maker of Progif, there was ever a city that looked like it was designed for quiet horror stories. It's medieval Prague, cobbled streets, narrow alleys, candlelight reflecting off wet stone. It practically begged for someone sinister to appear out of the fog. In the mid-1300s, that someone was a candle maker named Jan of the Old Market. Most people knew him as polite, solitary, and extremely particular about his wax. He bought animal fat in large quantities and complained if it wasn't fresh enough. Nothing too odd, until people realized the missing beggars and orphans around the market usually vanished near his shop. When the city guards finally searched the place, they found vats of tallow that smelled distinctly wrong. Inside, mixed with the wax, were human remains. Jan confessed to killing for better wax. He believed, he said, that human fat made candles burn cleaner. He wasn't entirely wrong. But after his execution, the city council banned candle makers from working after dark, just to calm everyone down. Marjorie of the Fieldingman, 1320. In a tiny hamlet outside York lived Marjorie, a midwife and healer who could have been any old village woman, except her patients kept dying in strangely similar ways. For years, no one questioned it. Childbirth was dangerous, infection common. But eventually, the local lord's daughter died in Marjorie's care, and suddenly the helpful woman became a suspect. A search of her cottage turned up dozens of trinkets, bits of jewelry, and locks of hair taken from the dead. Tokens, she said, for prayers. The clergy called it necromancy during questioning. Marjorie admitted that she sometimes shortened pain for the suffering by pressing a pillow over their faces. Whether she meant mercy or convenience, nobody asked. The court called her a killer, and that was that. It's strange how often medieval killers came disguised as caretakers. Maybe that's what made them so invisible, the fact that their hands were supposed to save. Life, cheap and fragile, you start to notice something drifting through all these stories. Back then, life wasn't sacred in the way we imagine it now. Most people didn't live long. Disease, famine, war, everything could kill you before your 30th birthday. So when someone disappeared, people mourned briefly and moved on. The idea of methodical murder barely existed. Killing was just part of the landscape, like weather. That's what made the true predators so hard to see. They hid inside the noise of daily death. And maybe that's why history forgot them. Konrad Stumpp. The Pilgrim Slayer, Germany, again, around 1370. Pilgrimages were the medieval version of vacations, except with more blisters and fewer souvenirs. Tens of thousands of people trudged across Europe every year, sleeping in barns and trusting the kindness of strangers. Among those kind strangers was Konrad Stumpp, a self-proclaimed guide who offered safe passage through the Black Forest. Pilgrims would follow him into the trees. Some never came out. Eventually, a merchant escaped and told the story. Konrad robbed and strangled travelers, then buried them beneath a fallen oak. He'd been doing it for years, moving from path to path. Confident that no one would notice, they caught him by chance. A broken wheel on his cart, a patrol that stopped to help, and a trail of blood leading to the woods. He confessed easily, almost proudly. When asked why, he said, "The forest was quiet when they stopped breathing." It's the kind of sentence that doesn't leave your head once. You've read it in a dusty record. The world between candles. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost feel the rhythm of those centuries. Church bells, market cries, footsteps on stone. And somewhere between them, the slow pulse of fear that never really stopped. People prayed louder, locked their doors tighter, and told stories about demons to make sense of what humans had done. Every era blames monsters from the outside, but the Middle Ages had plenty growing quietly inside their own walls. We've met nobles who killed for power, peasants who killed for hunger, and hermits who killed for reasons even they couldn't name. The line between madness and evil was thin, maybe non-existent. So, as you drift off, imagine those candlelit rooms, the smell of wax and smoke, the sound of distant hooves fading down a dirt road. The world turns, the darkness settles, and another name slips out of memory, because history doesn't remember every monster. It just remembers the ones who got caught. We're staying in the Middle Ages a little longer. The fire's low, the air smells faintly of old books and damp stone, and we're heading back into the world where crime was mostly solved by guessing and divine luck. Because, for all its prayers and penance, medieval Europe had an odd relationship with killing. Murder was bad, obviously. But if you did it in the name of family honor, God, or the local baron, it was sort of fine. And that moral fog was perfect for people who wanted to kill quietly, over and over again. So, settle in. Let's drift through some of the cases that blurred the line between superstition, sickness, and plain cruelty. The poisoner of Lübeck first stop tonight is Lübeck, a wealthy port city on the Baltic coast, full of merchants, spices, and people who loved to gossip. In 1358, the city began noticing something odd. Entire families would fall sick after dinner. Same meal, same symptoms, same tragic ending. The culprit turned out to be a woman named Greta Ulst, a housemaid who moved frequently from home to home, always hired after a funeral, always gone before the next one. When she was caught, she confessed to poisoning her employers with arsenic mixed into stews. Her reason was both simple and chilling. She liked watching the slow process. She said it made her feel like God deciding when breath ends. At her trial, the judges argued whether she was insane or just evil. The court didn't reach a conclusion. It rarely did. They simply tied her to a post and burned her, which was medieval shorthand for case closed. Her name barely survived the century. Only a few lines in a city ledger remain, written in that calm Latin tone historians love, executed for wickedness. The bone collector of Milanif, he lived in 14th century Milan. You probably knew a man like Lorenzo the quiet, slightly odd neighbor who fixed things, stayed up late, and didn't talk much. He worked as a gravedigger, which already put him in the mildly cursed category of professions. For years, he was just part of the background noise of death, until a friar visiting the cemetery noticed something strange. Several graves recently disturbed, the bones cleaned, arranged, and missing pieces. When the city guards searched Lorenzo's shack, they found the missing bones carved into tools, handles, even toys. He said he liked their smoothness. No one could prove he'd killed anyone, but the number of fresh corpses missing parts made the city uneasy. They hanged him anyway, because when in doubt, that's what you did. Milan quickly replaced him, and life went on because the living had work to do, and the dead weren't going to complain. Agnes of the Well England again. Late 1200s, villagers near Lincoln spoke in whispers about a woman called Agnes of the Well, a healer who could cure fevers, help crops grow, and make rivals fall mysteriously ill. When two merchants were found dead near the well she tended, everyone knew what had happened, though no one could explain how. The priests called it witchcraft. The sheriff called it murder. Agnes said she'd never harmed a soul, and maybe she hadn't. Her trial mixed folklore and fear into one long performance. Witnesses said she whispered to the water. Another claimed to see her burying dolls in the soil. They drowned her to find out if she was guilty. She didn't float. So, naturally, they declared her innocent. After she was dead, medieval justice often had that kind of logic problem. The mad surgeon of Avignon now let's travel south, to Avignon, the papal city. It's the early 1300s. Cardinals debate theology by candlelight. Plague rumors drift through the streets. And in a small rented house near the city walls lives Dr. Raymond Dessous. Raymond had studied medicine in Montpellier and, by all accounts, was gifted until something snapped. He began performing private experiments on patients, trying to discover what he called the spark of divine life. Servants told stories of screams from his cellar, of bodies stitched and unstitched. When the authorities investigated, they found dozens of dismembered remains preserved in brine. Raymond explained calmly that he was searching for the secret of resurrection. The court declared him possessed. They burned the house, sealed the cellar, and buried what they found in consecrated ground, because even in madness, people still feared the soul might wander. No one spoke his name for generations. But somewhere in Avignon's archives, there's still a note in a scribe's neat Latin, doctor of rare ambition and unholy practice. The forgotten ones, what's striking, when you read old trial records, is how brief they are. A few sentences to sum up a life. Confessed, hanged, burned. That's it. No exploration, no analysis, just finality. The Middle Ages didn't need motives. They just needed closure. And that, in a strange way, made them sleep easier than we do now. The nun who saw too much in the early 1400s. Near Rouen, there was a convent where the sisters claimed to see visions. Angels, saints, and sometimes darker things. Among them was Sister Matilda, a young woman known for her gentle voice and oddly specific prophecies. One night, after a new novice arrived, several nuns vanished. Matilda said they had been taken by spirits. Months later, workers repairing the convent cellar found the bodies, buried, wrapped in habits. Matilda confessed quietly, saying she'd killed them to purify their faith. She believed their deaths would bring divine peace. The abbess turned her over to secular courts, which was unusual. They executed her at dawn, then held a special mass for the repose of her soul. The surviving sisters swore they could hear her singing during the service. Medieval people believed in that sort of thing. Maybe it comforted them. Drifting towards silence if you've made it this far tonight. You can probably feel that steady hum of quiet terror the medieval world ran on. No police, no psychology, no concept of serial killing, just a patchwork of belief, guilt, and ritual. To us, these stories sound distant and primitive, but beneath the candles and prayers, they're uncomfortably familiar. Every killer we've met so far wanted control, over life, over fear, over something slipping through their fingers. And maybe that's the oldest instinct of all, to wrestle with the dark, even if it swallows you. So, for tonight, let's leave them there, in the flicker of torchlight, in the brittle parchment of forgotten court records, in that quiet moment when history stops caring and memory fades. Because somewhere, deep in that silence, the Middle Ages are still watching. The baker of Lisieux moved now to Liege. Early 1300s, a city of winding streets, smoky ovens, and a population that mostly trusted their bakers, until they didn't. Jean Le Fourneau was the baker in question. On the surface, he seemed ordinary, kneading dough, keeping his shop tidy, and handing out bread with a polite nod. But a few villagers noticed strange patterns. Children who visited the shop for treats sometimes never came home. And then there were the neighbors who said his flour smelled slightly metallic. Eventually, an investigation uncovered something grisly. Hidden in the back of his oven were small bones, charred and mixed with ashes. Jean confessed under questioning, explaining that he was testing the limits of heat on human flesh. He claimed he wanted to understand how the body reacted to fire. The city council was understandably unimpressed. Jean was executed, probably before he could finish his next batch of experimental pastries. The story faded quickly. Life in medieval Liege was busy, loud, and full of small tragedies that people preferred to forget. The blacksmith of Ghent, 1380s, full of canals, guilds, and, like every medieval city, enough unsolved deaths to keep chroniclers busy. Enter Bram van der Wal, a blacksmith known for his strong arms, grim expression, and habit of working late into the night. Some villagers found it odd that he frequently left work carrying large sacks, which he refused to explain. Years later, authorities found that the sacks contained bones, human bones. Some said Bram had strangled travelers who asked for work, hiding their remains in the canals to keep the water fresh. Bram was captured after a neighbor noticed a particularly loud scream at midnight. The trial was short. His confession was thorough. the sentence predictable, and then life in Ghent returned to normal, as it always did, leaving Bram as a whisper in the background of the city's long history. Elizabeth of Nuremberg back to the German lands. Late 1500s, Elizabeth was a minor noblewoman, married young, widowed early. History describes her as intelligent, secretive, and slightly melancholy. But locals whispered darker things: missing servants, strange noises at night, and a chilling fascination with poisons. Elizabeth apparently enjoyed experimenting with them quietly, adding tiny doses to soups and stews over months. She claimed it was for the health of the household, but the results were undeniable. Several family members died unexpectedly, and neighbors began connecting dots they weren't supposed to see. Eventually, she was caught and sentenced to house arrest for life, a mild punishment compared to the standard execution. Perhaps her rank spared her, or maybe they didn't want to draw attention to how easily a noblewoman could kill without consequences. The widow of Wittenberg. Let's take a quieter turn now. Wittenberg, early 1400s. A widow named Hedwig lived alone after her husband's untimely death. She kept to herself, tending her small garden, caring for a few chickens, and occasionally helping neighbors. But over several years, local authorities noticed a pattern. People who borrowed supplies from her often disappeared. When Hedwig was questioned, she admitted to killing a handful of people, not for profit, not for passion, just because. She explained that death seemed calmer than life, and sometimes she wanted company in the quiet. The court was baffled. Hedwig didn't fit the usual category of criminal. She wasn't a bandit or a noble schemer. She was simply a killer, moving unnoticed in plain sight. The sentence was execution, but chroniclers spent more time debating her motives than reporting the event itself. Reflections on patterns. By now, a pattern emerges. Some medieval killers were motivated by wealth, some by obsession, some by madness. Some were protected by power, while others moved unnoticed in rural villages. Yet across all these centuries, all these countries, one thing remained: the slow, patient process of life allowed them to exist. Villagers, officials, and clergy all assumed that the deaths were accidents, curses, or divine punishment. Few connected the dots. Few asked the uncomfortable question: what if a human being is behind it all? And so, the darkness persisted, quietly, tucked into corners of castles, forests, and city streets. The Tailor of Bruges. Late 1300s. A city of canals, wool, and quiet streets where everyone knew everyone's business, or at least they thought they did. Enter Henrik de Wever, a tailor with nimble fingers and a taste for the unusual. His shop smelled of cloth, dye, and something faintly metallic that people couldn't place. Henrik was polite, always offering a seat to clients, measuring fabric with care, and occasionally humming a soft tune while cutting patterns. But when villagers began to disappear, whispers started. First a child, then a servant, then a traveling merchant. When authorities investigated, they found hidden compartments beneath his shop floor containing bones, scraps of clothing, and tiny tools. Henrik confessed calmly, explaining that he was creating miniature figures to commemorate those who had wronged him. Or so he claimed. He was executed, of course. But the city never forgot the quiet man who used scissors, thread, and silence to leave a trail of death. The shepherd of Tirolhai in the Alps. In the 1400s, a shepherd named Lorenz Moser tended flocks in isolation. The mountains were beautiful, yes, but also cold, dangerous, and lonely. And loneliness, as we've seen, can sometimes breed strange obsessions. Lorenz began preying on travelers who strayed too far into the alpine passes. The bodies were often carried down hidden gullies, and no one suspected a simple shepherd who whistled to his sheep and kept to his cottage. Eventually, Lorenz was caught when a merchant's wife recognized the cloak he had taken from her husband. Under interrogation, he confessed to multiple murders, claiming he wanted to feel alive in a quiet world. The execution was swift, hanging at dawn, and then the mountain returned to silence. Sheep grazed, wind blew, and the story faded. The forgotten servant of Rouen back to France. Early 1500s, a young servant named Etienne, working in a noble household, discovered that he had a peculiar gift, the ability to slip through life unnoticed. He realized that this invisibility could be useful. For several years, Etienne killed quietly, selecting victims who annoyed him or who were in the way of his ambitions. No records exist of how many. His methods were simple: poison in food, careful strangling, and silent disposal in cellars and riverbanks. Eventually, he was caught when a visiting noble noticed a strange absence of a household servant. By then, Etienne had moved on to new targets, and the trial records are frustratingly brief. His name survived only in a few scribbled lines in the archives. Servant executed for crimes unknown in full. It's a perfect medieval story. A person can kill quietly for years, and history barely pauses to note it. Patterns of darkness as we float through these quiet centuries. The same patterns emerge again and again. The noble who kills for power or obsession. The commoner who kills for survival, boredom, or strange private motives. The isolation that hides behavior and protects it. The fear and superstition of villagers that masks repeated crimes. And the common thread is almost always the same: humans, quietly, efficiently taking life when circumstances allow, preparing to drift so as the night settles deeper. Imagine the quiet streets, the dimly lit workshops, the lonely paths through forests and mountains. Imagine people living lives of routine, only occasionally breaking into acts that would shock us today, if we weren't already half asleep imagining them. The medieval world was not full of monsters hiding in the shadows. The monsters walked beside everyone else, humming, smiling, tending to work, and disappearing before anyone noticed. Perhaps that's why the world remembered them only briefly, or in fragments, court records, whispers, and the occasional chronicler's note. And as you drift, think of the quiet rhythm of the streets, the faint creak of doors, the soft flicker of candlelight in rooms where people once lived and, in some cases, quietly died. History doesn't remember every monster, but tonight we remember a few. The Chamberlain of Gentaz. Our night drifts deeper into quiet streets and shadowed alleyways. Let's meet one last figure in part 2. Willem van den Berg, a chamberlain in Ghent during the late 1400s. Willem's life seemed ordinary at first. He tended to the lord's household, polished silver, and arranged dinners. But over time, a pattern emerged. Servants would disappear, quietly, without much notice. Some left notes, some never returned from errands. Willem had discovered a peculiar method for control. He kept meticulous journals, notes on movements, meals, and small punishments, and used that information to select victims. Unlike the dramatic nobles or wandering hermits we've met, Willem preferred subtlety. His killings were clean, unremarkable, almost administrative. Eventually, a visiting dignitary noticed a series of irregularities in the household accounts. Suspicion led to an investigation, and Willem was arrested. During questioning, he displayed an eerie calm, as if detailing tax records rather than murders. The court had no choice but to execute him, but the city quickly returned to business as usual. In the bustling streets, Willem's story faded, leaving only a whisper in the archives, reflections on a quiet darkness by now. A gentle pattern emerges from the shadows of medieval Europe. Cruelty often lived in quiet, ordinary places: castles, workshops, monasteries, and cottages. None were immune. Some killers were noble, some common, some motivated by obsession, boredom, or madness. But they all shared one thing: the ability to move in a world that rarely questioned life's value. A world without modern police, forensics, or psychology. The Middle Ages were not dramatic in the way we imagine from movies. They were slow. They were methodical. They were a place where monsters could live alongside the living, quietly shaping fear without anyone fully realizing it. Hey guys, tonight we linger again in medieval Europe, moving through quiet villages, candlelit castles, and the foggy forests where monsters weren't always myth. They sometimes walked right beside you. If you've been following along, you know the pattern. Nobles who killed for obsession, peasants who killed for survival, and everyone in between, quietly leaving traces of darkness behind. Tonight, we'll meet a new set of characters, some familiar in spirit, others almost forgotten by time. Dim the lights, tuck yourself in, and let's wander slowly through the streets, where whispers tell stories louder than bells ever could. The Watchman of Cologne. Early 1400s, the city was bustling with trade, rivers of people, and the occasional suspicious death. Hermann Klaus, a watchman, was tasked with patrolling the streets at night. His job: keep the city safe, scare off thieves, and look intimidating in a half-burned uniform. Hermann did his job a little too well. Over the years, people began disappearing during his patrols. Travelers, street vendors, even the occasional nobleman lost to the night. When authorities investigated, they found that Hermann had a cellar beneath his watchtower filled with belongings taken from the missing. He claimed he only kept them safe and that any deaths were accidental. The court didn't buy it. Hermann was executed, but the city returned to quiet, as if nothing had happened. The canal waters lapped against the stone, carrying away rumors and bones alike. The weaver of Ghent-weaver guilds was central to city life, producing cloth that spread across Europe. But in the late 1300s, one weaver in Ghent, Matthias van der Loom, developed a strange obsession with control. He began killing young apprentices and villagers who failed his standards. Not for wealth, not for love, not even for revenge. Simply to maintain the perfection he desired in his work and in life. Matthias was meticulous. He hid bodies in lofts, under floorboards, even inside looms. For years, no one noticed missing people, assuming they had left the city or joined other guilds. Eventually, a fellow guild member noticed the disappearances aligned with Matthias's workshop schedule. When caught, he confessed in a calm, almost bored manner. The city hanged him, and the Weavers' Guild replaced him, quietly erasing his existence from daily life. The Lady of the Lake sort of now we drift to Scandinavia. Early 1500s, villagers around a small lake told tales of a noblewoman named Ingrid von Hell, who was rarely seen in town but often near the water at night. Strangers who passed by her manor sometimes vanished. Fishermen whispered of strange lights and screams on the lake, and children were warned not to go near. Ingrid was eventually discovered to have lured victims into her castle under the guise of charitable work, keeping them hidden in cellars. She was tried, found guilty, and executed, but her story became shrouded in folklore. Half horror tale, half legend, the villagers never spoke her name again. Only the lake, still calm and reflective, kept her memory alive. The Monk of Munstera, quiet monastery in Munster. Mid-1400s, the abbey was orderly, disciplined and devoted, except for one monk, Brother Anselm, who had darker impulses than prayer could contain. Anselm's crimes were subtle, almost invisible. Poisoned meals here, a dropped candle there, whispers in the night. No one suspected the pious monk until multiple deaths coincided with his duties in the kitchen. When confronted, he confessed without much emotion, citing spiritual necessity and a desire to purify the abbey of sinners. Authorities executed him, but the abbey continued its routines. Bells ringing, prayers recited, as if nothing had changed. Reflections on hidden cruelty, the common thread among all these stories is quietness. Medieval killers rarely sought fame. They didn't advertise their deeds. They moved carefully, sometimes methodically, sometimes impulsively, but almost always unnoticed until someone caught a clue. And perhaps that's the most haunting part. These were ordinary people, often working ordinary jobs, living ordinary lives, until they weren't. The Miller of Nuremberg, early 1400s, a city of cobblestones, spice, and occasional shadows stretching longer than the street lamps could reach. Enter Hans the Miller, a quiet man who ran a watermill outside the city walls. Villagers knew him as competent, polite, and slightly odd. He preferred solitude, which is always a subtle red flag in the Middle Ages. Over several years, travelers stopped by for food or lodging, then disappeared without a trace. Authorities finally discovered that Hans had used his mill as a trap. Bodies were hidden in sacks of grain, floated down the river, or buried in nearby fields. When caught, Hans confessed in a calm, almost academic tone. He explained that life seemed simpler without certain nuisances. The court executed him swiftly. But in Nuremberg, life continued as usual, the river flowing silently past the mill. The apothecary of Paris. Late 1500s, the city was full of intrigue, artisans, and students. Among them was René the apothecary, who sold herbs, powders, and concoctions for every imaginable ailment. But René had a secret. Some of his mixtures were lethal, administered quietly to select customers, or perhaps competitors. Historians suspect that several merchants and minor nobles died under mysterious circumstances after visiting his shop. When he was finally caught, René's trial was more about scandal than law. He defended himself calmly, claiming he only acted to maintain the balance of commerce. The court did not sympathize. René was executed, his shop closed, and his secrets mostly forgotten. Except for faint whispers among Parisian apothecaries, the tailor of Lubeck, 1450s. Another tailor story, because apparently scissors and fabric were more lethal than one might assume. Klaus Weber worked in a modest shop, sewing clothes for merchants and nobles alike. Over time, villagers noticed young apprentices disappearing. Some suspected the plague. Others murmured of something darker, when authorities investigated. They found hidden chambers beneath the shop, containing remains of apprentices. Klaus confessed, claiming he had been inspired by visions that told him to shape souls like cloth. Execution followed, but the story faded, leaving only the occasional line in city records. Klaus Weber, tailor executed for unknown misdeeds. The cook of Bologna, early 1500s, known for its pasta, scholars, and a certain cook named Marco della Tavola. Marco's kitchen was his sanctuary. But over several years, townspeople began disappearing after dining at his house. Some suspected illness, others blamed spirits. Eventually, Marco was caught mixing toxic herbs into meals. He confessed readily, stating that he wanted to control fate and decide who should live. The court was unimpressed. Execution followed, and the city returned to routine. The smell of pasta and sauce masking the echoes of his deeds. Reflections on shadows by now. A pattern emerges once again. Killers hiding in plain sight. Blending into ordinary roles, leaving only faint traces. Nobles, servants, tradesmen, and clergy, each capable of quiet cruelty. The Middle Ages didn't need monsters in the shadows, because monsters often walked among the living, and the slow rhythm of daily life, travel, work, religion, allowed them to continue unnoticed for years. History, when it bothers to remember them, does so only in fragments. Court records, whispers, and occasional chronicles. The Gardener of Toledo, early 1500s. A city of winding streets, quiet courtyards, and gardens that smelled of herbs and flowers. Diego el Jardinero. The gardener was a man of gentle manners and a love for plants. Villagers knew him as quiet, diligent, and harmless. But over the years, travelers and servants began disappearing, sometimes vanishing near the city walls, sometimes leaving only faint traces of belongings in his garden. Diego's method was subtle. He laced certain plants with toxins, carefully measured and hidden, so that a meal or even a touch could be fatal. When caught, he confessed in a calm, reflective manner, saying he wanted the garden to hold secrets as well as beauty. The court executed him, but as always, life in Toledo returned to normal. Gardens bloomed, streets bustled, and only the faint scent of herbs remained as a quiet reminder of Diego's deeds. The baker's apprentice of Rouen, mid-1400s, a small bakery at the edge of town employed Lucian, an apprentice who seemed timid, polite, and eager to please. But Lucian harbored a darker curiosity. Over several years, he experimented with poisons in baked goods, testing reactions and observing results. The townsfolk thought some deaths were caused by bad flour, disease, or coincidence. Eventually, a wealthy client noticed a pattern and alerted authorities. Lucian confessed without emotion, noting that he wanted to learn the limits of life. Execution followed, and the bakery closed for a few days. But the town's life quickly resumed, as if nothing had happened. We drift again into the quiet corridors of medieval Europe, where castles, abbeys, and village houses held more than just candles and furniture. They held secrets. The world back then moved slowly. Life was routine, predictable, and often harsh. But within that rhythm, certain people carved out shadows for themselves, quietly taking lives while the rest of the world carried on. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's wander through a few more forgotten corners of history, where ordinary people became extraordinary in their capacity for quiet cruelty. The chambermaid of Heidelberg, early 1500s, a city of scholars, markets, and an imposing castle that overlooked the Neckar River. Clara, a young chambermaid, worked in the castle, polishing silver, arranging linens, and moving silently through hallways. She seemed harmless, almost invisible. But over time, members of the household began disappearing. Clara's methods were subtle, poisoning drinks, tampering with candles, and occasionally misdirecting visitors into unsafe parts of the castle. She was caught when a visiting noble noticed inconsistencies in mealtimes and discovered her hidden vial collection at trial. She confessed matter-of-factly, explaining that she wanted to see who truly respected the castle's hierarchy. Execution followed, and the castle resumed its routines, as if nothing had happened. The falconer of Burgundy, late 1400s. Falconry was a pastime for nobles, and Germain, a falconer, was tasked with training birds and caring for them. On the surface, he was loyal, skilled, and polite, yet several hunting companions vanished during expeditions, leaving no trace beyond their equipment and footprints. Germain's methods were clever, using birds to distract victims while he acted quietly. Eventually, hunters began noticing the pattern, leading to an investigation. Germain confessed, claiming he wanted to test the loyalty of those who followed him into the forest. The court executed him, but the forest remained quiet, and the birds continued their flights over the Burgundy hills. The Nun of Lübeck, back in Germany, early 1500s. A convent near Lübeck was home to Sister Agnes, a nun known for her quiet devotion and precise work in the scriptorium. Over time, novices and servants began disappearing. Some were found months later, hidden within unused chambers, their deaths unexplained. Agnes confessed during questioning, citing visions and divine guidance as her motivation. The abbess handed her over to secular authorities, and she was executed. The convent returned to prayer, candlelight, and manuscript work, as if nothing had changed. The cobbler of Prague, mid-1400s. Cobbler shops lined narrow streets, filled with the smell of leather, wax, and polish. Jacob, a cobbler, was skilled, friendly, and entirely unremarkable, until a series of disappearances coincided with visits to his shop. Authorities investigated and found hidden compartments beneath the floorboards, containing bones and personal belongings of missing villagers. Jacob confessed calmly, claiming he wanted to preserve them in leather, as one preserves shoes. The city executed him, closed the shop, and life continued. The cobbled streets carried footsteps, horses, and whispers of lost people, but mostly, nobody remembered Jacob beyond a brief note in the archives, reflections on quiet power watts. Striking about these cases is how normal life continued around the acts of violence. Families ate, merchants sold goods, students studied. Deaths were recorded, mourned briefly, and life carried on. It's a pattern that repeats through medieval history. Ordinary people, quietly committing extraordinary acts, blending into the slow rhythm of life. Monsters weren't always hiding. Often, they walked beside you in candlelit corridors, in market stalls, in workshops and cloisters. Unnoticed at blacksmith of Okanogan, early 1500s, a city of hot forges, clangs of iron, and the occasional squeal of a horse on cobblestones. Heinrich, a blacksmith, was strong, quiet, and diligent. Villagers knew him as reliable, though slightly gruff. But over the years, people began disappearing near his forge. Travelers, apprentices, and occasional merchants simply vanished. When authorities investigated, they discovered a hidden cellar beneath the forge, containing tools, bones, and charred remnants of belongings. Heinrich confessed without dramatics, claiming he wanted to forge life in a new shape. The court executed him, but life in Aachen returned to the same rhythm. Forges burned, horses trotted, and merchants sold wares. Heinrich became a faint whisper, a shadow in the city's archives. The innkeeper of Strasbourg's Burg, mid-1400s. Inns were lively, noisy, and full of travelers, merchants, and occasional nobility. Friedrich, an innkeeper, seemed ordinary. Warm meals, clean beds, and friendly smiles. But over time, guests began disappearing after staying at his inn. Some thought it was plague, others blamed accidents, and a few suspected Friedrich himself. Eventually, an investigation revealed hidden rooms in the inn's upper floors. Friedrich confessed calmly, explaining that he wanted to test who could be trusted in the city. Execution followed. The inn closed temporarily, then reopened, bustling with travelers unaware of its past. The monk of Dunkelone, late 1400s. The abbey was quiet, disciplined, and devoted. Brother Peter, a monk, had the reputation of being pious and diligent. But within the abbey, novices and servants began disappearing. Some were found months later, hidden in unused chambers, dead of unexplained causes. Brother Peter confessed, claiming visions and divine guidance motivated him. The abbey handed him over to secular authorities, who executed him. Life in the abbey continued, prayers recited, bells ringing, as if nothing had happened. The gardener's apprentice of Florence, early 1500s. Gardens in noble estates were vast, beautiful, and meticulously maintained. Lorenzo, a gardener's apprentice, seemed polite, hard-working, and unremarkable. Yet over the years, several young apprentices vanished quietly. Lorenzo confessed to their debts, claiming he wanted to understand life through its absence. He was executed, and the gardens remained fragrant and blooming, indifferent to the quiet darkness that had passed through them. Reflections on shadows by now. A pattern is clear. Ordinary people in ordinary roles, quietly moving through life, sometimes stepping beyond the bounds of morality. Often unnoticed, life continued around them. Families ate, merchants traded, students studied, and clergy prayed. Deaths were recorded briefly, mourned quietly, and then the rhythm of daily life resumed. Monsters didn't always lurk in forests or dungeons. They walked beside everyone else, blending seamlessly into a world of candles, cobblestones, and quiet routines. The apothecary's assistant of Verona, early 1500s. Apothecaries were respected, quietly busy with herbs, tinctures, and powders. Alessandro, an assistant, seemed diligent, polite, and careful with every ingredient. Over several years, villagers who visited the shop occasionally disappeared or fell mysteriously ill. Alessandro confessed during questioning, explaining that he was experimenting to understand the fine line between life and death. The court executed him, but the shop reopened under new management. Life continued as usual. Herbs were sold, powders measured, and citizens largely unaware of the quiet darkness that had once moved through the city. The lantern keeper of Bruges, late 1400s. Street lamps were few, and lanterns kept by local keepers lit only small portions of the city. Simon, a lantern keeper, walked the streets at night, extinguishing lamps or lighting them as needed. Villagers noticed that travelers sometimes vanished in the dimly lit alleys, but few connected Simon to the disappearances. Eventually, authorities investigated when a particularly persistent merchant reported multiple missing companions. Simon confessed, calmly stating he enjoyed the quiet control of darkness. He was executed, and the streets slowly regained their light, though the memory of his deeds lingered only in a few archival notes. Medieval Europe was not full of loud, monstrous horrors. It was full of slow, deliberate, often invisible human actions that history barely recorded. The people we'll meet now are less famous, less remembered, and that's exactly what makes them interesting. Ordinary lives, ordinary jobs, and extraordinary secrets. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's wander slowly through villages, forests, and workshops where quiet cruelty often passed unnoticed. The Potter of early 1500s, a small town with clay-rich soil, winding streets, and a bustling pottery trade. Friedrich, a potter, seemed ordinary. He shaped bowls and jugs with care, greeted customers politely, and occasionally delivered commissions to local nobles. But over the years, villagers noticed occasional disappearances. Children who went to fetch water, travelers visiting the market, servants sent on errands when authorities investigated. They discovered hidden compartments beneath Friedrich's workshop. Bones, scraps of clothing, and personal effects hinted at years of quiet killings. Friedrich confessed, explaining that he wanted to preserve people as one preserves clay, shaping them into memory. The town executed him, but life continued. Clay was still molded, pots fired in kilns, and the town's rhythm barely paused for the quiet darkness that had existed among them. The miller's wife of Antwerp, mid-1400s, mills were noisy, messy, and full of the smell of grain and flour. The miller's wife seemed helpful, kind, and industrious, but several villagers vanished quietly, often after visiting her mill for supplies or advice. Authorities eventually discovered that she had laced food with small doses of poison over the years. Margarethe confessed matter-of-factly, stating that she wanted to keep the town orderly and quiet. The execution was swift. Life in Antwerp resumed. Grain ground, bread baked, and the smell of flour masking the echoes of her deeds. The scribe of Rouen, late 1400s, a quiet scriptorium produced illuminated manuscripts and religious texts. Jean, a scribe, was diligent, careful, and polite, but he had a darker curiosity. Over several years, apprentices and clerks went missing. Some were found months later, hidden within unused rooms or staircases, dead from unexplained causes. Jean confessed calmly, claiming he wanted to understand life by observing its absence. The abbey handed him over to secular authorities, who executed him. The scriptorium continued its work, candles flickering, manuscripts written, as if nothing had changed. The shepherd of Carinthia high in the Alps. Carinthia, early 1500s. Matthias, a shepherd, lived alone in the mountains, tending sheep and moving quietly through the alpine passes. Travelers occasionally disappeared, often while crossing his territory. Matthias was eventually caught when a merchant noticed his missing companions and followed the trail into the mountains. He confessed calmly, explaining he wanted to feel alive in the quiet expanse. Execution followed, and the mountains remained still, wind whispering over sheep grazing peacefully, as if nothing had happened. Patterns in quiet shadows again. A clear pattern emerges. Ordinary jobs, quiet lives, hidden darkness. Villagers assumed deaths were accidents, disease, or divine punishment. Few connected the dots, and fewer still suspected people they saw every day. Monsters were rarely loud or dramatic. They were careful, deliberate, and often invisible, moving through a world that barely noticed. The tanner of Lübeck. Early 1500s. Tanneries were noisy, smelly, and full of soaking vats of animal hides. Hermann, a tanner, seemed ordinary, hard-working, precise, and quiet. But villagers noticed occasional disappearances, travelers, apprentices, and local workers. Authorities eventually discovered hidden pits beneath the tannery, containing bones and personal belongings. Hermann confessed, calmly explaining that he wanted to transform life into something more permanent. Like leather, execution followed, but the tannery resumed its usual rhythm. Hides soaked, tools clanged, and life moved on. The innkeeper's son of Ghent. Mid-1400s, inns were bustling with travelers. Merchants and occasional nobles. Rudolf, the innkeeper's son, seemed polite and helpful, running errands and serving guests. Yet villagers began to notice a pattern. Some guests never left. When authorities investigated, hidden rooms were discovered above the inn's stables. Rudolf confessed, stating he wanted to learn who could be trusted and who could not. Execution followed, and the inn reopened, bustling with travelers who never knew the quiet darkness that had existed above the stables. The cook of Mainz. Late 1400s, kitchens were busy, filled with aromas of bread, meat, and stews. Klaus, a cook, seemed reliable, friendly, and competent. But villagers occasionally fell ill or vanished after meals prepared by him. Authorities eventually uncovered hidden compartments beneath the kitchen floor, containing remains of victims. Klaus confessed matter-of-factly, saying he wanted to decide who deserved nourishment and who did not. Execution followed, and the kitchen continued its work. Pots clanged, bread baked, and meals served. As if nothing had happened, the locksmith of Nuremberg, early 1500s, locks, keys, and doors were his craft. Jakob, the locksmith, seemed polite, precise, and helpful. Villagers trusted him with their homes and businesses. Yet over the years, travelers and apprentices disappeared quietly. Authorities discovered hidden spaces in his workshop, containing evidence of his crimes. Jakob confessed calmly, explaining he liked knowing the secrets of doors and lives alike. Execution followed. Life returned to normal. Locks turned, doors opened, and Nuremberg continued its rhythm, patterns in hidden darkness. The same theme emerges: ordinary professions, ordinary routines, extraordinary secrecy. Life carried on around these quiet predators. Villagers assumed accidents, illness, or bad luck. Few suspected people they saw every day. The rhythm of medieval life was slow and deliberate, and these killers blended seamlessly into that rhythm. Monsters were not always dramatic or visible. They moved silently, deliberately, often unnoticed until discovery, or not at all. The carpenter of Boz. Early 1500s, carpenters' workshops were filled with the smell of sawdust, the clatter of hammers, and the quiet rhythm of work. Leon, a carpenter, seemed ordinary, diligent, polite, and meticulous in his craft. Over the years, villagers and travelers began disappearing quietly. Apprentices failing to return home, merchants who had stayed the night, and wandering laborers. Authorities eventually investigated and found hidden compartments beneath his workshop floor, containing evidence of his crimes. Leonhardt confessed calmly, explaining that he wanted to preserve order and silence in his workshop. as one preserves wood from rot. Execution followed, and the workshop returned to normal. Sawdust in the corners, hammers striking nails, and life moving forward. The midwife of Rouen, mid-1400s, Isabeau, a midwife, was trusted with one of life's most delicate moments, birth. She was polite, caring, and efficient, yet over time, several women and infants vanished or were found dead under mysterious circumstances. Isabeau confessed to her crimes during questioning, citing a strange sense of control over life and death as her motivation. She was executed, and life in Rouen continued. Births happened, midwives worked, and the streets carried the rhythm of everyday life, as if nothing had changed. We linger once more in the quiet corners of medieval Europe, moving through castles, monasteries, and village streets where life was slow, orderly, and yet occasionally punctuated by whispers of something darker. The figures we meet now are less famous, almost forgotten, but their stories remain, tucked away in court records, local chronicles, and the faint echoes of legend. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift slowly through another set of quiet lives touched by hidden darkness. The steward of Avignon. Early 1500s, the city hummed with trade, church, ceremonies, and the constant movement of people through streets and markets. A steward in a minor noble's household, managed accounts, organized meals, and oversaw staff. He appeared diligent, quiet, and unremarkable. Yet over several years, servants and visitors began vanishing quietly. Benut's methods were subtle, misdirecting staff, keeping hidden keys, and using minor poisons in meals. When discovered, he confessed without dramatics, stating he wanted to maintain order and efficiency in the household. Execution followed, and life in the Avignon house continued. Meals served, accounts balanced, candles flickering as usual. The falconer's apprentice of Vienna, mid-1400s, falconry was a pastime of the elite, and Ulrich, an apprentice falconer, trained birds and tended to the birds' needs. Over time, several hunting companions and visiting nobles vanished quietly during excursions. Ulrich's methods were clever, using falcons to distract or manipulate victims while he acted unnoticed. Eventually, authorities pieced together the pattern. Ulrich confessed calmly, claiming he wanted to test loyalty and courage. Execution followed, and the falcons continued their flights over the Austrian countryside, indifferent to the shadows that had once moved among them. The brewer of Ghent, early 1500s. Brewing beer was a daily rhythm, boiling kettles, measuring grains, and storing barrels. Joris. A brewer appeared diligent, polite, and hard-working. Yet villagers occasionally vanished after visiting his brewery, some never returning from a simple errand. Authorities discovered hidden storage spaces beneath the brewery containing evidence of his crimes. Joris confessed, stating he wanted control over the flow of life, like the flow of beer. Execution followed, and the brewery resumed its usual rhythm, kettles boiling, barrels rolling, and villagers largely unaware of the quiet darkness that had existed among them. The monk of Strasbourg, late 1400s. The abbey was a place of quiet prayer, manuscript work, and candlelight. Brother Theobald appeared dedicated, disciplined, and pious. Over time, novices and staff began disappearing. Some were found months later, hidden within unused chambers, dead from unexplained causes, Brother Theobald confessed calmly, claiming divine guidance motivated his actions. The abbey handed him to secular authorities, who executed him. Life in the abbey continued. Prayers recited, bells ringing, manuscripts copied, as if nothing had happened. Patterns in quiet shadows again. We notice a pattern. Ordinary professions, ordinary routines. Extraordinary secrecy. Life carried on around these predators. Families ate, merchants traded, students studied, and clergy prayed. Deaths were noted briefly, mourned quietly, and life moved on. Monsters were rarely dramatic or visible. They moved silently, deliberately, and often unnoticed, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of medieval life. The Tailor of Lubeck. Early 1500s. Tailors' shops were full of cloth, scissors, and the faint scent of dye. Conrad, a tailor, seemed diligent, polite, and ordinary. Yet over time, villagers and apprentices quietly disappeared. Authorities eventually discovered hidden spaces beneath the shop, containing the remains of victims. Conrad confessed calmly, claiming he wanted to shape people as one shapes cloth. Execution followed, and the shop reopened, scissors snipped, fabrics folded, and life carried on as if nothing had happened. The baker of Bruges. Mid-1400s, bakeries were warm, fragrant places with bread, pastries, and the occasional gossip, Jan. A baker seemed friendly, hard-working, and reliable. But over several years, villagers vanished quietly after visiting the bakery. Some assumed illness. Others blamed bad flour. Authorities eventually discovered hidden compartments beneath the bakery, containing evidence of his deeds. Jan confessed, stating he wanted to control who partook of the bread. Execution followed, and the bakery resumed its rhythm, ovens burning, dough kneaded, bread baked. The apothecary of Verona. Early 1500s, apothecaries were central to city life, dispensing remedies and advice. Lorenzo, an assistant, seemed careful, polite, and knowledgeable, yet villagers began disappearing quietly, some never leaving the shop. Lorenzo confessed during questioning, explaining that he was experimenting to understand the boundary between life and death. Execution followed, and the shop reopened under new management. With life continuing as usual, the shepherd of Tirolhai in Tyrol. Early 1500s, shepherds were solitary, tending flocks across quiet alpine valleys. Matthias, a shepherd, seemed ordinary, gentle with animals, quiet, and solitary. Travelers occasionally vanished quietly while passing through his territory. Authorities eventually discovered the pattern, and Matthias confessed, calmly noting he wanted to feel alive in the quiet mountains. Execution followed. Sheep grazed, wind whispered, and the mountains remained indifferent. Patterns in hidden life through workshops, bakeries, apothecaries, abbeys, and mountains. A pattern repeats. Ordinary lives, ordinary jobs. Hidden darkness. Villagers assumed illness, accidents, or misfortune. Few suspected people they saw every day. Medieval life was slow, deliberate, and orderly, allowing quiet predators to move unseen. Monsters were rarely dramatic or visible. They moved deliberately, silently, almost invisibly, blending seamlessly into everyday life. The lantern keeper of Bruges. Late 1400s, street lamps were few, and lanterns kept by local keepers lit only small portions of the city. Simon, the lantern keeper, walked the streets at night, lighting lamps and ensuring the few that existed stayed lit. Villagers noticed travelers occasionally vanished in dim alleys, but Simon went largely unnoticed. Eventually, authorities investigated when a persistent merchant reported multiple missing companions. Simon confessed calmly, noting he enjoyed the quiet control of darkness. Execution followed. Life resumed, lanterns glimmered, streets filled with footsteps, and citizens largely forgot the quiet shadow that had once moved among them. The Cobbler's Apprentice of Nuremberg. Early 1500s, cobbler shops were small, filled with leather tools, and the rhythmic clatter of shoes being made. An apprentice appeared diligent, polite, and unremarkable, yet villagers began disappearing quietly. Some were found months later in hidden spaces beneath the workshop. Jakob confessed without dramatics, claiming he wanted to understand who deserved to walk in the world and who did not. Execution followed. Life returned, shoes crafted, leather stretched, and the town continued its quiet rhythm across workshops, streets, bakeries, abbeys, and mountains. Ordinary people moved quietly, sometimes stepping beyond morality, leaving only faint traces. Medieval life was slow, deliberate, and orderly, which allowed these quiet predators to blend seamlessly into the rhythm of everyday life. History barely remembers them. A name here, a trial record there, perhaps a whisper in a chronicle. Yet, when we read these fragments, we can feel the pulse of medieval Europe, the quiet tension, the flicker of candlelight, and the invisible shadow of human behavior moving silently through streets, corridors, workshops, and alleys. We wander once more through the quieter corners of medieval Europe, moving through castles, manor houses, monasteries, and village streets. Life was slow, measured by candlelight, the clatter of footsteps, and the rhythm of routine, but within that rhythm, shadows often moved unseen. The figures we meet now are lesser known, tucked away in trial records and local chronicles, yet their stories remain. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift gently through another set of quiet lives touched by hidden darkness. The Chamberlain of Dijon, early 1500s, a city of markets, courtyards, and noble houses. Ge, acute, Rard, a chamberlain, managed a noble household with meticulous care. He appeared polite, efficient, and entirely ordinary, yet over time, servants and minor visitors began vanishing quietly. Gerard's methods were subtle, misdirecting staff, using hidden passages, and occasionally tampering with food or drink. When authorities finally investigated, Gerard confessed without dramatics, stating he wanted order and control over the household. Execution followed, and the castle resumed its usual rhythm. Meals served, candles flickering, footsteps echoing along corridors. The Falconer of Prok. Mid-1400s, falconry was a pastime of nobles, and Otto, a falconer, trained birds and tended to their needs. Over several years, hunting companions and visiting nobles occasionally vanished quietly during expeditions. Otto used the birds cleverly to distract or manipulate victims while he acted unseen. Authorities eventually pieced together the pattern. Otto confessed calmly, claiming he wanted to test the courage and loyalty of those who followed him into the forest. Execution followed, and the falcons continued their flights, indifferent to the shadows that had once moved among them. The innkeeper's wife of Ghent. Early 1500s, inns were bustling with travelers, merchants, and occasional nobles. The innkeeper's wife appeared helpful, friendly, and ordinary. But villagers noticed a quiet pattern. Guests sometimes disappeared after staying at the inn. Authorities discovered hidden rooms above the stables and within the attic. Margarethe confessed calmly, stating she wanted to determine who could be trusted in the city. Execution followed, and the inn resumed its usual rhythm. Guests arrived, meals served, and the city's life continued as if nothing had happened. The scribe of late 1400s, manuscript production was meticulous, quiet work and the newt, a scribe, appeared diligent, careful, and polite. Yet over several years, apprentices and clerks went missing. Some were found months later, hidden in unused rooms, dead from unexplained causes. The newt confessed calmly, saying he wanted to understand life through its absence. Execution followed. The scriptorium continued its work. Candles flickered, quills scratched, and manuscripts slowly came to life as before. Patterns in quiet darkness, a pattern emerges once again. Ordinary professions, ordinary lives, hidden darkness. Life carried on around these quiet predators. Families ate, merchants traded, students studied, clergy prayed. Deaths were noted briefly, mourned quietly, and the rhythm of life resumed. Monsters were rarely dramatic or visible. They moved silently, deliberately, almost invisibly, blending seamlessly into everyday life. The cobbler of Strasbourg. Early 1500s, cobbler shops lined narrow streets, filled with the smell of leather, wax, and polished. A cobbler seemed diligent, polite, and entirely ordinary. Yet villagers began to notice that some apprentices and travelers vanished quietly. Authorities eventually discovered hidden compartments beneath the shop floor, containing personal belongings and evidence of his actions. Jacob confessed calmly, explaining he wanted to know who deserved to walk freely in the city. Execution followed. Life returned to normal, leather stretched, shoes crafted, and the streets once again filled with footsteps. The tanner of mid-1400s, tanneries were noisy, smelly, and filled with vats of soaking hides. Hermann, a tanner, appeared ordinary, precise, and quiet. Villagers occasionally disappeared while delivering goods or visiting the tannery. Authorities eventually uncovered hidden pits beneath the tannery containing evidence of his crimes. Hermann confessed calmly, claiming he wanted to preserve life like one preserves leather. Execution followed. The tannery continued its usual rhythm. Hides soaked, tools clanged, and the town carried on. The baker's apprentice of Antwerp. Late 1400s, bakeries were warm, fragrant, and full of daily activity. Rudolf, the baker's apprentice, seemed polite, diligent, and unremarkable. Yet visitors occasionally vanished quietly after spending time in the bakery. Authorities discovered hidden compartments beneath the floor containing evidence of Rudolf's actions. He confessed, stating he wanted to control who shared in the bread. Execution followed. The bakery resumed. Ovens burned, dough kneaded, bread baked, and life continued its slow rhythm. The lantern keeper of Bruges. Early 1500s, street lamps were sparse, and lanterns kept by a single keeper lit only small portions of the city. Simon, a lantern keeper, seemed ordinary, walking streets at night, lighting lamps and maintaining them. Yet travelers occasionally vanished in dim alleys. Authorities eventually investigated, and Simon confessed calmly. noting he enjoyed controlling darkness. Execution followed, and lanterns flickered once more as life resumed. Patterns in hidden lives across workshops, bakeries, tanneries, streets, and lantern-lit alleys. A pattern repeats. Ordinary professions, ordinary routines, extraordinary secrecy. Life carried on around these quiet predators. Families ate, merchants traded, students studied, clergy prayed. Deaths were noted briefly, mourned quietly, and life resumed. Monsters rarely made themselves known. They moved silently, deliberately, almost invisibly, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of medieval life. We wander again through medieval Europe, lingering in the quiet streets, workshops, inns, and abbeys. Life was slow, deliberate, and measured by candlelight. Footsteps and the rhythm of routine, but in the shadows. Secrets often moved silently. The figures we meet now are nearly forgotten, tucked away in trial records or obscure chronicles. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift gently through another set of lives touched by hidden darkness. The apothecary of Cologne. Early 1500s, apothecaries were central to daily life, dispensing remedies, herbs, and advice. Heinrich, an assistant, seemed careful, polite, and knowledgeable. Yet villagers occasionally disappeared quietly, some never leaving the shop. Authorities discovered hidden compartments beneath the apothecary, containing the remains of victims. Heinrich confessed calmly, claiming he was experimenting to understand the boundary between life and death. Execution followed. The shop reopened, life resumed, and the rhythm of Cologne carried on. Oblivious, the cook of Mainz. Mid-1400s, kitchens were noisy, warm, and fragrant. Klaus, a cook, seemed diligent, friendly, and competent. But villagers occasionally vanished after meals prepared by him. Authorities eventually uncovered hidden compartments beneath the kitchen floor, containing remains and evidence. Klaus confessed without drama, stating he wanted to decide who deserved nourishment and who did not. Execution followed, and the kitchen resumed its work. Pots clanged, bread baked, and meals served the shepherd of Carinthia. Early 1500s, shepherds were solitary, moving flocks across alpine valleys. Matthias, a shepherd, seemed ordinary, quiet, gentle with animals, and solitary. Yet travelers occasionally vanished while passing through his territory. Authorities eventually discovered the pattern. Matthias confessed, calmly noting he wanted to feel alive in the quiet mountains. Execution followed. Sheep grazed, wind whispered, and the mountains remained indifferent. The tanner of Nuremberg. Late 1400s, tanneries were noisy, smelly, and filled with vats of soaking hides. Jacob. A tanner seemed ordinary, diligent, precise, and quiet. Yet villagers and apprentices quietly disappeared over the years. Authorities eventually discovered hidden pits beneath the tannery, containing evidence of his crimes. Jacob confessed calmly, claiming he wanted to preserve life like one preserves leather. Execution followed, and the tanneries resumed their usual rhythm. Patterns in hidden darkness once again. The theme repeats. Ordinary professions, ordinary lives. Hidden darkness. Life carried on around these quiet predators. Families ate, merchants traded, students studied, clergy prayed. Deaths were noted briefly, mourned quietly, and life continued. Monsters were rarely dramatic or visible. They moved silently, deliberately, almost invisibly. blending seamlessly into the rhythm of everyday life. The potter of Unchecked. Early 1500s. Pottery workshops smelled of wet clay, earth, and wood fires. Friedrich, a potter, seemed ordinary, polite, diligent, quietly shaping bowls, mugs, and jugs. Yet over the years, villagers and apprentices quietly disappeared. Authorities eventually discovered hidden compartments beneath the workshop, containing bones and personal belongings. Friedrich confessed calmly, explaining he wanted to preserve people like he preserved clay, shaped, contained, and quiet. Execution followed, but the workshop reopened, clay molded, kilns fired, and life carried on. The miller's wife of Antwerp. Mid-1400s. Mills were busy, noisy, and fragrant with grain and flour. A miller's wife, seemed helpful and ordinary. Yet villagers occasionally vanished quietly after visiting the mill. Authorities discovered hidden spaces beneath the mill floor, revealing evidence of her actions. Margarethe confessed, calmly explaining she wanted order and control over the town's rhythm. Execution followed, and the mill resumed. Grain ground, bread baked, and daily life continued. The lantern keeper of Bruges. Early 1500s, street lanterns were few, lighting only small portions of the city at night. Simon, a lantern keeper, walked the streets, lighting and extinguishing lamps. Travelers occasionally vanished quietly in the dim alleys. Authorities investigated, and Simon confessed calmly, stating he enjoyed the quiet control of darkness. Execution followed. Lanterns flickered once more, streets filled with footsteps, and life carried on. The cobbler of Strasbourg. Mid-1400s. Cobbler shops smelled of leather, wax, and polish. Jakob. A cobbler seemed diligent, polite, and ordinary. Villagers noticed apprentices and visitors disappearing quietly over the years. Hidden compartments beneath the shop revealed evidence of his crimes. Jakob confessed, claiming he wanted to decide who deserved to walk freely in the city. Execution followed, and life returned to normal. Leather stretched, shoes crafted, and footsteps echoed along streets. Patterns in quiet shadows, through workshops, bakeries, mills, lantern-lit streets, and cobbler shops. The pattern is clear. Ordinary lives, ordinary professions, hidden darkness. Life carried on around these quiet predators. Families ate, merchants traded, students studied, clergy prayed. Deaths were noted briefly, mourned quietly, and the rhythm of life resumed. Monsters rarely made themselves known. They moved silently, deliberately, almost invisibly, blending seamlessly into medieval life. We drift once again into the quieter corners of medieval Europe, lingering in castles, manor houses, workshops, and alleyways where life was slow, deliberate, and measured by candlelight footsteps and routine. The figures we meet now are lesser known, nearly forgotten, yet their stories remain in scattered chronicles and trial records. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift gently through another set of lives touched by hidden darkness. The Chamberlain of Dijon. Early 1500s, noble houses were orderly, polished, and bustling with servants. Gerard, a chamberlain, managed one such household, appearing polite, efficient, and ordinary. Yet over time, minor staff and visitors quietly disappeared. Gerard's methods were subtle, misdirecting staff, using hidden passages, and occasionally tampering with meals. When authorities discovered his crimes, he confessed calmly, stating he wanted order and control over the household. Execution followed, and life in the castle continued. Meals served, candles flickering, footsteps echoing along corridors. The falconer of Prog, mid-1400s. Falconry was a pastime of nobles, and Otto, a falconer, trained birds and tended to them with care. Over the years, hunting companions and visiting nobles occasionally vanished quietly during expeditions. Otto cleverly used the falcons to distract or manipulate victims while he acted unseen. Authorities eventually discovered the pattern. Otto confessed calmly, claiming he wanted to test the courage and loyalty of those who followed him into the forest. Execution followed, and the falcons continued their flights, indifferent to the shadows that had moved among them. The innkeeper's wife of Ghent. Early 1500s, inns were bustling, full of travelers, merchants, and occasional nobles. The innkeeper's wife seemed helpful, friendly, and ordinary. Yet guests sometimes vanished quietly after staying at the inn. Hidden rooms were discovered above, the stables and in the attic. Margarethe confessed calmly, explaining she wanted to determine who could be trusted in the city. Execution followed. The inn resumed its usual rhythm. Meals served, travelers arriving, city life continuing as before. The scribe of late 1400s scriptoriums were quiet. Candlelit spaces where manuscripts were copied. A scribe appeared diligent, careful, and polite. Yet, over several years, apprentices and clerks disappeared. Some were found months later, hidden in unused rooms, dead from unexplained causes. Benut confessed calmly, saying he wanted to understand life through its absence. Execution followed. The scriptorium continued its work. Candles flickered, quills scratched, and manuscripts slowly came to life. Patterns in quiet darkness, ordinary lives. Ordinary professions, hidden darkness. Life carried on around these quiet predators. Families ate, merchants traded, students studied, clergy prayed. Deaths were noted briefly, mourned quietly, and life continued. Monsters were rarely dramatic or visible. They moved silently, deliberately, almost invisibly, blending seamlessly into everyday life. The cobbler of Bruges. Early 1500s, cobbler shops lined the cobblestone streets, filled with leather, wax, and polish. Jacob, a cobbler, seemed diligent, polite, and unremarkable. Yet villagers and apprentices began disappearing quietly over the years. Authorities discovered hidden compartments beneath the shop containing evidence of his crimes. Jacob confessed calmly, stating he wanted to decide who deserved to walk freely in the city. Execution followed. The shop reopened, leather stretched, shoes crafted, and footsteps echoed along Bruges streets once more. The miller of mid-1400s. Mills were busy, fragrant with grain and flour, noisy with grinding wheels. Rudolph, a miller, appeared hard-working and ordinary, yet villagers occasionally vanished quietly while visiting the mill. Authorities eventually uncovered hidden spaces beneath the floor, revealing evidence of his actions. Rudolph confessed calmly, explaining he wanted control over the rhythm of life and grain. Execution followed. The mill resumed, wheels turning, grain ground, bread baked, and the town carried on. The potter of late 1400s. Potteries smelled of wet clay, earth, and wood fires. Friedrich, a potter, seemed ordinary, polite, diligent, quietly shaping bowls, mugs, and jugs. Yet villagers quietly disappeared over the years. Authorities eventually discovered hidden compartments beneath the workshop. Friedrich confessed calmly, explaining he wanted to preserve people like clay-shaped, contained, and quiet. Execution followed, and the pottery workshop reopened, life carrying on as usual. The lantern keeper of Cologne. Early 1500s, street lanterns were sparse, lighting only portions of the city at night. Simon, a lantern keeper, walked streets, lighting lamps and maintaining them. Travelers occasionally vanished quietly in dim alleys. Authorities eventually investigated, and Simon confessed calmly, stating he enjoyed the quiet control of darkness. Execution followed. Lanterns flickered once more, streets filled with footsteps, and life resumed its usual rhythm. Patterns in hidden lives through workshops, mills, lantern-lit streets, bakeries, and pottery shops. A pattern emerges. Ordinary lives, ordinary professions. Hidden darkness. Life carried on around these quiet predators. Families ate, merchants traded, students studied, clergy prayed. Deaths were noted briefly, mourned quietly, and life continued. Monsters rarely revealed themselves. They moved silently, deliberately, almost invisibly, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of medieval life. Hey guys, tonight we drift one last time through medieval Europe, moving through streets, workshops, inns, and abbeys where life was slow, measured by candlelight footsteps and routine. The figures we meet in this final part are the quietest, the almost forgotten names in old chronicles, traces in court records, shadows that history barely remembers. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's float gently through the last stories of hidden darkness. The carpenter of Bos. Early 1500s, carpenters' workshops smelled of sawdust, pine, and the faint smoke of wood fires. Leonhardt, a carpenter, seemed ordinary, polite, diligent, and careful with his craft. Yet villagers and apprentices quietly disappeared over the years. Authorities eventually discovered hidden compartments beneath the workshop floor. Leonhardt confessed calmly, claiming he wanted to preserve order and silence in his workshop, as one preserves wood from rot. Execution followed, and the workshop reopened, sawdust in corners, hammers striking nails, and life moving forward. The midwife of mid-1400s, midwives were trusted with the most delicate moments of life. Birth is a bow. A midwife seemed gentle, competent, and ordinary. Yet several women and infants vanished quietly over time. Authorities investigated, and Isabeau confessed during questioning, stating she felt a strange sense of control over life and death. Execution followed, and the abbeys, houses, and streets of Rouen carried on. Babies were born, midwives worked, and life continued its rhythm. The brewer of Gilles. Early 1500s, breweries were fragrant with hops and malt, filled with the clatter of barrels and the hum of daily work. A brewer appeared diligent, friendly, and ordinary. Yet villagers occasionally vanished quietly while visiting the brewery. Authorities discovered hidden storage spaces beneath the brewery. Joris confessed calmly, stating he wanted control over the flow of life, like the flow of beer. Execution followed. The brewery resumed its usual rhythm, kettles boiling, barrels rolling. and villagers largely unaware of the quiet darkness that had existed among them. The monk of Strasbourg, late 1400s, abbeys were quiet, candlelit spaces filled with prayer, manuscript work, and slow footsteps. Brother Theobald appeared devoted, disciplined, and pious. Yet novices and staff occasionally vanished quietly. Some were found months later in unused chambers, dead from unexplained causes. Brother Theobald confessed calmly, claiming divine guidance motivated him. The abbey handed him to secular authorities, who executed him. Life in the abbey continued. Prayers recited, bells ringing, manuscripts copied, as if nothing had happened. Patterns in quiet shadows shows carpentry workshops, midwives' rooms, breweries, and abbeys. A pattern is clear. Ordinary lives, ordinary professions. Hidden darkness. Life carried on around these quiet predators. Families ate, merchants traded, students studied, clergy prayed. Deaths were noted briefly, mourned quietly, and life continued. Monsters rarely revealed themselves. They moved silently, deliberately, almost invisibly, blending seamlessly into the rhythm of medieval life. Picture it now, the scent of sawdust in a workshop, the warmth of bread and beer in a brewery, the soft flicker of candlelight in an abbey, and the quiet shuffle of a midwife tending her wards. Somewhere in that rhythm, history's quiet predators moved, deliberate, unseen, almost invisible. Tonight, you've walked among them again, drifting slowly through streets. Workshops, abbeys, and alleys carried gently by the calm, hypnotic cadence of story. Sleep now, and let the quiet streets, candlelit corridors, and lamplit alleys of medieval Europe carry you deeper into dreams. And so, our journey concludes. We've wandered through inns, workshops, abbeys, streets, and mountains, meeting the quietest predators of medieval Europe. Ordinary lives, extraordinary secrets, and the rhythm of history moving forward. Almost oblivious to the shadows that once moved among them. History forgets many things. But through stories like these, the faint traces of forgotten lives linger. Gentle reminders of the human patterns that persist across centuries. Good night. And may your dreams drift slowly, like candlelight flickering in quiet medieval corridors, carrying you through the gentle shadows of history.